Have you ever seen a Mountain Mist quilt, or have you ever made one? If you have, please be sure to tell me all about it in the comments below. Hello everyone, I'm Michelle Fox and welcome to The Simple Quilter. If you want to know what Mountain Mist quilts are, or if you just want to know more about them, then keep watching. I began learning about Mountain Mist quilts several years ago, and it has been one fun journey. In today's video, I'm going to tell you what a Mountain Mist quilt is. I'm going to show you some pictures of some that I've seen, that I've taken. I'm going to show you some of the patterns the original Mountain Mist quilts were made from. And I'm going to share some resources with you in case you want to make a Mountain Mist quilt. Mountain Mist quilts were made from patterns on the back of Mountain Mist Quilt batting wrappers. These were put out by the batting department of Stearns & Foster, and these made their debut in 1930. And it's really pretty amazing because you can still purchase Mountain Mist batting today. Stearns & Foster hired Frederick Hooker in 1928 to be the sales manager for the batting department of Stearns & Foster. Frederick Hooker, he coined the name Mountain Mist, and he developed a campaign to promote the sale of Mountain Mist quilt batting, and he did just that. His sales campaign was amazing. I've done a couple of Mountain Mist presentations for a couple of quilt guilds. This is a very condensed version of those presentations. Now, as part of his sales campaign to promote Mountain Mist batting, he hired an artist, he hired pattern designers, and he hired several quilters to help him in this campaign. He and his team came up with the design for the wrappers as well as the patterns that were on the back. Now here is what the patterns look like. These were the Mountain Mist patterns, and they just wrapped around the batting. And then on the back you can see the pattern. Now I'll do a little bit closer up view of this in just a little bit. I have a couple of different ones to show you, but I'll switch to the overhead camera in a little bit and I'll show you how that's done, how those are, and I'll give you a closer look at those. He hired the quilters to make model quilts out of each pattern. So these first quilts that were made and the ones following that were made from these Mountain Mist patterns became known as Mountain Mist Quilts. The original model quilts became part of the company's permanent quilt collection, and that collection now resides in Lincoln, Nebraska in care of the International Quilt Museum. Frederick J. Hooker's advertising campaign greatly increased the sales of the Mountain Mist batting, but it also did another thing. It fueled the quilt revival of the 1930s. His goal, of course, was to promote the sale of the batting, but he also wanted to create patterns that were easy to read and follow and that were accurate. And I have to say, I think he did just that. I have visited with quilters whose mothers sewed with the Mountain Mist quilt patterns as well as they sewed with them, and they said they were very easy to follow. And I saw one of the quilts that one of the quilters had made, and it was a New York beauty. She had won several awards on it at the Kansas State Fair, and it was beautiful. The sales campaign was huge, and they began selling the patterns through the mail. Now, when you ordered one from the mail, you got one that looked more like this. It wasn't, it was just the plain pattern. And these were some of the catalogs, the little pocket catalogs that were used to order those patterns. They also had blue books that held colored photos of the quilt patterns. You can find some of those original blue books on Etsy or eBay. If you're interested in seeing those, you can order those. They're kind of expensive, but they're just old ephemera surrounding the sale of the Mountain Mist batting. As part of the sales campaign, the Stearns & Foster Company lent out some of their quilts, some of those original quilts in their quilt collection, and they would send them in these wooden crates to companies like Sears and Roebuck. They would have pamphlets that would tell the companies like Sears how to promote the sales of, their quilt fabric and quilt supplies by displaying the quilts and putting kits together. It was just really a huge campaign, and they did all of this, and they sent those quilts all around the U.S., and it simply boosted the sale of that product. They also advertised in magazines like Better Homes and Gardens, and that one's still around today. Woman's World, I believe that one's still around today, and Needlecraft. It was such an amazing campaign, in my opinion. I was amazed as I read about his sales campaign, and it was successful because the quilters of that era were also good consumers, and they bought up the batting as well as the patterns. I mentioned that the collection is housed at the International Quilt Museum, and that museum cares for the quilts, but they're not always on display. Wes and I went to visit the museum, and we got to see one sunflower quilt. That was a Mountain Mist quilt. That was the only one they had on display at that time. But if you happen to go to the museum, be sure to ask to see if they have any of the Mountain Mist quilts on display. Now I want to take a few minutes, and I'm going to put my overhead camera on, and I'm going to show you a little bit of a close-up of the patterns. Now here you can see this is one of the early patterns, but I thought this was interesting. This is a coupon that came on the wrapper. Just in case you didn't like the one that was on the back, you could order another one. It says for 20 cents with this coupon. The regular price of the pattern was 35 cents. Save this wrapper. There is a valuable quilt pattern on the reverse side. And then it says, note, patterns for quilts shown on this wrapper and in our catalog may be ordered at a savings with the coupon printed below. And then when you turn this over on the back, there's your quilt pattern. And now it's interesting because you really couldn't tell what was on the back because the batting was wrapped in there some, kind of like that. And I guess women could peek, maybe, somehow, but they didn't always know which one they were getting. Now the copyright here says 1941. The yardage, it had quilting suggestions, and I thought that was really neat. This one's called Bluebirds for Happiness. Just beautiful quilt patterns. Now here's a little catalog where you could order some supplies as well as the Mountain Mist batting and some quilt books. And you could order the patterns, the batting, the patterns, and other quilt supplies from that. Now, when you ordered one of the patterns from here, this is what you got. You didn't get, of course, the wrapper. This is the sunflower quilt. I showed you a couple of pictures of this, but this is what the pattern looked like. Let me tell you a little bit about the quilt behind me. It is not a Mountain Mist quilt, but it has been mistaken for one, and it's because the design has little dogwood petals on it, but it is not a Mountain Mist quilt. But I wanted to hang it because it is the closest thing I have to a Mountain Mist quilt. Now this quilt does have an interesting story. When Wes and I went to Lubbock to visit the museum there, we were antiquing, And when we were in one of the antique shops, Wes said, "Hey, you got to come and look at this quilt. It's 50% off." And this is a beautiful quilt. It is hand appliqued, hand pieced. The binding is put on by hand. And I paid $75 for this quilt. It is a lovely, precious quilt. But that's the story of the quilt behind me, just in case you're interested. Wes and I later again visited the Texas Tech Museum in Lubbock, and we went there to see a display of Mountain Mist quilts. Now, they weren't the original Mountain Mist quilts that the company owned, but they were Mountain Mist quilts made from, of course, Mountain Mist patterns back in the 1930s. And there were beautiful, beautiful quilts there. In fact, I'm going to show you some of the pictures of the quilts that I took while we were there. First picture is a picture of a beautiful quilt called the New York Beauty, and it was beautiful. The second quilt is a picture of a quilt called the Sunflower. Now, this is really interesting because this is the picture of one that I took at the Texas Tech Museum. But here is a picture of one that I took. This was the only quilt Wes and I saw at the International Quilt Museum, and this is the Sunflower quilt that hung there. And you can see how different colorways were used to create these quilts and how both of them are the same pattern but look much different. This quilt is called Poinsettia. I think a lot of the Mountain Mist quilts must have been applique quilts because there were a lot of applique quilts at that exhibit. This next one is called Dogwood, and I love this. I love the teal color that they used. It just makes those dogwood blooms pop out there. Beautiful, beautiful quilt. This next one is called the Ohio Rose. And it's another applique quilt. And then the next one is called Tulip Bowl. Now, I think this looks a little modern and futuristic in my opinion, but this is what was made back then. And again, it was another applique quilt. Now, this next one is one of my favorites because I like just traditional quilting. This one is just a red and white quilt, which I do love, and it is called Homespun. Those are just a few of the Mountain Mist quilts that I took pictures of. And if you ever get a chance to see a Mountain Mist quilt display, if any museums near you have a display like that, be sure you go to see them. It is worth going to see those quilts. If you're interested in making Mountain Mist quilts, there are two quilt books out there that you can use. The first one is one that was published by Linda Pumphrey, or that was written by Linda Pumphrey, and it says 14th Mid-Century Quilts Made New, Mountain Mist Historical Quilts, and she uses more modern techniques to show how these quilts can be made. And then the other one is put out by Leisure Arts, and it's Mountain Mist Quilt Favorites. Now, in the description below, I'll put a couple of links there if you're interested in purchasing either of these books. And if you can't find them there, or if they run out, you can check Etsy and eBay. You can even check secondhand bookstores. They might have them also. But these are neat books if you would like to order, or if you would like to make a Mountain Mist quilt. In the description below, I'll also include a link to the International Quilt Museum. You can go there and see a video tour of the display that they had there of the Mountain Mist quilts. It's actually a pretty neat little video, and you'll get to see some of those original quilts. And again, they are simply beautiful. If you have any comments or additional information you'd like to share about Mountain Mist quilts, please be sure to put that in the comments below. I love to hear experiences that you all have had with those, and maybe some of you have seen some of the quilts that I've seen. Again, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and until next time, have fun quilting.